Welcome! In this video we'll be taking a quick look at Enme, the epic grade tank class Elune. Starting off at his base stats at 6 stars level 60, he has a very nice 48.5k HP, 2.6k attack, and a 5.1k PDEF with a 5.4k magic defense. His speed at 103 does put him a little bit on the slower side, but that is okay as he is a tank and not needed to go first turn. As you transcend him up to the max at +5, his HP goes up to a very nice 72.8k. His attack ending at a 3.9k, which is fine as he is not there for attack. His physical and magic defense do end up at a decent 7.6 and 8.2k. For an epic grade, these are pretty good stats. Looking in at his skills, his first skill. This skill is a default AoE skill, attacking all enemies. This does magic damage equal to 30 plus 45% of his attack as magic damage. As the damage is not that high, it is a constant AoE attack, dealing damage to every enemy on the battlefield. This can be both good and bad depending on what is happening in certain situations, such as in PvP, where you're fighting a team that has a Wei who heal based on damage done, or if they have a Freya on the team who also heals every time you do damage. This is also a drawback to him, as this attack will always trigger those heals, healing the team more than you would like to happen. As the skill is leveled up, it goes up to 260 plus 62% of his attack as magic damage as the AoE, meaning this skill does not hit very hard at all, and like I said, it could trigger the healing more so than the damage that it does in most cases, making this a skill that actually does negative damage to the team that you're fighting. For PvE situations, however, this skill is decent as it does do an AoE attack, and if you do have some decent attack on Enme, you can use this as a skill for killing off those waves of enemies. Looking in at a special skill, this is a 4-soul skill. This skill is a single target, can be anybody on the battlefield. This one is again a magic damage that does 80 plus 140% of his attack and applies a spell effect that banishes the target for 2 turns. The banished targets cannot receive any type of healing or buffs or cleanses, but they also cannot be attacked to do any damage to them. This essentially takes the unit out of the fight completely for those 2 turns. As the skill is leveled up to the max at +6, it goes up to a decent 770 plus 188% of attack as magic damage. The banish effect also goes up to a 3-turn duration, meaning that if you do banish a target using this skill, they will be out of the fight for 3 turns. This can be helpful if you're fighting certain situations, such as if you're fighting in PvP, the Artemail. As this takes Artemail completely out of the fight, he will not be able to be revenging on or countering your team with his Judge passive, meaning that he's not going to be healing or doing damage to you. This is a very effective CC, as there's nothing they can do to get rid of it. Looking in at his ultimate attack, his ultimate, this is a buff. This gives an enhanced buff that reduces the magic damage received. This is different than just a buff that increases magic defense. This one actually just reduces the magic damage received and does not increase the magic defense of the allies, meaning that this works with magic defense buffs. This skill does the buff by 150 plus 2% of his max HP for 3 turns. As the skill is leveled up to the max at 6, it goes up to a 650 plus 4% of his max HP for 4 turns. What this does, it means that any magic damage that is equal to this amount gets reduced. So if someone is attacking with low magic damage, perhaps from a Wei skill 1, this buff can actually just negate the damage altogether to 0. This lasts for 4 turns, making this somewhat of a helpful skill as it just removes the damage in the case. It does not just reduce it down like a defense buff would. This actually can just stop all damage completely. So having him on a very high HP build is recommended for this, as this buff can reduce any magic damage taken by a significant amount. So if you're fighting a team that has a high magic damage attacker, then this can reduce the damage that your team takes by just removing the damage a portion of the damage completely. This works really well against magic damage that is multi-hits, as it can reduce those hits down to almost nothing, because each hit would have its damage reduced by the amount set by this. So for example, if you're fighting a Reeve, then she does magic damage on a multi-hits. Those hits then would be reduced by this amount by the 650 plus 4% of Enme's max HP, meaning that she could potentially be doing almost no damage to your team at all every time she attacks it. Passive number 1 for him. This passive reduces magic damage that he receives by 20% for every target afflicted with Banish. This is not something that typically comes into play and will usually only affect him once, as typically you will only be banishing one target. The second passive, his passive number 2, makes him somewhat difficult to deal with in certain aspects of the game, as this does prevent him from dying, as that anytime he takes an attack that is fatal, he will just be banished and left with 1 HP for 2 turns. When this effect ends, he is then healed by 10% of his HP for each ally that is still alive, excluding him. This passive will not activate if there are no other allies alive on the battlefield, meaning that if you running him in the front line as a solo tank and you have 4 allies in the back, and he dies to this skill, which keeps him alive at 1 HP, the enemy cannot finish him off, as they cannot attack him anymore because he's banished, and it would just be 0 damage. This would mean that if all 4 of your other allies are still alive when that effect ends, then he comes back with 40% of his HP. So now he has it, and this passive is ready to go again. It will constantly activate as long as you have allies alive. It will keep activating, making him sometimes somewhat difficult to deal with, but also you can trigger this passive off, kill the rest of the team, and then when he comes back to life, he will have no HP, and then you can just simply kill him. His third passive. This passive increases damage dealt to any enemy that has higher HP than him by 20%. In most cases, you're not going to have to worry about this, as the only people that are going to have higher HP than him are going to be other tanks, meaning that it increases the damage he deals to tanks by 20%, which is not very significant because he won't be doing much damage to them anyway. This reduces the magic damage received from enemies with lower HP by 20%. This means that any enemy that has less HP than him, which are typically going to be the DPS enemies that you're going to have to worry about that are going to be killing him, this reduces their magic damage by 20%, meaning that if they are a physical damage attacker, this will not affect him at all. Looking in at his skill gems, his first skill is a magic damage AoE, which is recommended as a blue orange for magic damage and of course for crit rate. Now the affected here is a 5% chance to stun the target for 1 turn. This is actually recommended for him. Because it is a 5% chance to stun, it is very low, but the skill does nothing else, but is also an AoE attack, meaning that for every enemy that you hit with this, you have a 5% chance to stun them for 1 turn. This actually makes the skill useful if you do this, because it gives the skill a chance to stun every target that is hit by the AoE by 5%, making this actually useful if it does stun. In most cases it will not stun, but as the skill does nothing else can perhaps be a drawback by healing the enemies instead, then having the stun chance is helpful. The second skill, his special skill, this one is a blue-blue violent. As this skill does do decent damage, the blue-blue isn't bad for it. This has a 5% chance to restore 1 soul if you do it. But as this skill does do decent damage, going with another blue or perhaps an orange gem for the crit rate could help the skill do more damage, but he is not going to be your main damage dealer, so doing more damage isn't necessarily a big deal with him. So going with the chance to restore a soul isn't a bad option either. His last skill, which does increase the buff amount that it does by going with the yellow violent, the bonus is a 10% chance of increasing the target's magic defense by 10% for 2 turns. This is somewhat of a low amount, and it's a magic defense buff by only 10%, which is pretty insignificant. In fact, going with a full yellow set would increase the amount of the ability of the skill to absorb damage, making it even better, and it would be probably the recommended option to go with. Looking at the dimension slate for him, things that you would definitely want to focus are of course his magic physical defense and HP, as his third skill, his ultimate skill, is based on his HP. Having some accuracy on him isn't bad, so he can land those banish effects that you want to land. As far as other things, most of the other stats are not going to be needed on him, as he does not benefit that much from the attack, crit, or crit power, except for his second skill, as his first skill does such low damage. Adding more attack to it is not going to help it do that much more damage. Gear for him can be varied. There are many different options you can go with on him. The Ulysses set, a 3-piece set, gives him an increased physical and magic defense for 2 turns if he is hit by a crit, making him a little bit more tanky. This full 6-piece set also gives him a chance of casting Despair on the attacker for 2 turns. This actually can be somewhat helpful for any tank, as this does do a Despair buff when he doesn't even have to attack. This means as he is hit as a tank, he has a chance of putting that Despair debuff on the enemy team every time they attack him, which can be decent. You can go with other sets like the tank set or anything that reduces damage. Forgotten Hero, for example, does reduce damage based on if he has a buff or not, so you would need to make sure that you use his ultimate skill to give him that buff so that he has that damage reduction, or use something else on your team to give him buffs. Basically anything, even the corrupted Elune set would be helpful on him, as that set could help him out, as it would give him a extra utility by providing souls to your team every other turn. Overall, Enme isn't a bad tank, but he's not a great tank either. He is mostly suited for defending against magic damage, which is where his strength is. He does have the ability to CC a unit, not through provoke, but through banish. That actually makes it though so that you cannot do any damage to that enemy at all while they are banished, but it can be spammed on multiple enemies, allowing them to be banished multiple times, so that you can just keep them in that state. Or you can do multiple enemies that way to keep multiple enemies banished, but that just means you have to deal with them later once they come out of the banishment. He's not a very strong tank in terms of damage, but he does provide some utility, and depending if you're going up against a team that has high magic damage or multi-hit magic damage as their primary form of damage, then Enme is not a bad choice as a tank, as that his ultimate skill does provide a nice buff to your team to reduce the damage that they take because of that. In most cases, however, though, he is not going to be as useful to your team or as a tank, but he is an option to keep around, as he does have some decent effects for him, and he is decent for the world boss. That's going to be it for this one. If you have any questions or comments, please leave them below, and I'll answer them as soon as I can. Thank you.